Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. When I look at Marvel Comics' recent campaign to diversify its catalog of characters to include more heroes of color, there are clear reasons to me why this campaign pretty much failed. And some of the core reasons why this campaign failed have to do with the creators, and some of them have to do with the content. And when I look at the creators of this so-called diversified Marvel universe, where we have this Asian Hulk, this Pakistani Ms. Marvel, this black Spider-Man, this black Captain America, and this black female Iron Man, and this female Thor, I noticed that there are no real creators of color working on these characters. That's why these characters were pretty much shallow, half-hearted, and poorly developed. Most of these characters of so-called color were pretty much still produced by white males. So when we look at this diversity picture at Marvel Comics, the people behind the scenes are still the same white males. And here they are pushing diversity, pretty much running contradictory to the narrative they're pushing in their comics. If Marvel Comics was really serious about diversity, you would think they would be working on a campaign to hire more writers of color and more artists of color. But when we look at the comic book industry, there has been no real serious concerted effort to bring in writers of color and creators of color like myself for over 20 years. And this is one of the reasons why this campaign pretty much failed. Here you have writers trying to write characters they know nothing about and cultures they know nothing about. And this is one of the core reasons why many of the comics were so terrible. Because we have a white male writer trying to write about people's cultures and different experiences that they have no real understanding about. And writing a character of color, really, you have to understand that culture, you have to understand that cultural experience, and you have to understand what makes that culture important. And we really didn't see much of those cultures in these so-called diversified books. What we really saw, again, was a really flat reading experience. And when people look at this book, they're saying to themselves, what goes beyond this point? If I'm reading a comic, I want to read a great story. And when we look at the stories, they just weren't strong. Yes, we saw characters of color in stories, but the content of those stories did not have any depth. They didn't have any substance. They didn't have any heart. So readers had no incentive to buy them. Even worse, the readers could compare them to old books featuring these white male heroes and say to themselves, these books are better because these books have some depth, they have some character development, they have some story, and because they have better stories, I want to go read those. The other reason why this campaign pretty much failed is because it pretty much alienated the core customer base for comics. Now, again, people go to get comics are primarily white males, and comics usually are produced by white males for white males. And when they saw these new ethnic characters, many of these white males got turned off. So they had no incentive to go out and buy these new adventures. For them, Captain America is a white guy named Steve Rogers. Iron Man is a white man named Tony Stark. The Hulk is a white man named Bruce Banner. Spider-Man is a white man named Peter Parker. So when they look at these characters of color, they see poor imitations of their iconic characters they grew up with. And they want to pay money to see what they call the real Captain America, the real Iron Man, the real Hulk, the real Thor, and the real Spider-Man. They don't want to sit there and pay money to see affirmative action characters. So for them, there was no incentive to buy these comics on the regular. Now, the other issue people had with these diversity heroes had to do with the way they were pretty much presented to people and the way the concepts were executed. They were pretty much forced on people, and people in the comic book world don't like things being forced on them. An example of this is at DC Comics right now with their new 52, where they tried to tell people that the DC universe was over and they had to go by these rebooted characters. Comic fans revolted against that, and DC Comics has not recovered since. And Marvel now is suffering the same fate because they're going to try to tell longtime readers that they have to take these diversity heroes, and most comic fans pretty much said, I'm not buying this. And this is what led to the sales slump. They just didn't understand that when you have a customer base, you don't go out of your way to alienate them. This is marketing 101. You have this large core customer base, and if you want to expand your customer base, there's a way to do that. And Marvel Comics just didn't do that. Now, the best way to expand a customer base to really get diversity is this. Marvel Comics has many characters of color already in its existing catalog. Characters with established histories, characters that have followings. And what's really sad about this so-called diversity push is that all of those characters were pretty much ignored by Marvel Comics in this so-called diversity push. I can think of many characters such as Monica Rambeau, um, Night Thrasher, and Storm and many others, who many comic fans would love to go buy a book or see if they can carry a book and go to support. But many of those characters were pretty much ignored by Marvel Comics. These were characters, again, that had followings. These were characters that had fan bases. And these were the kind of characters that would add diversity because most of these characters are distinct. Most of these characters were already established as part of the Marvel Universe. And many of those characters just needed the right story to pretty much expand their fan base and become bigger fan favorites. It was all about giving these characters a push, and that would have added to the diversity. But because Marvel's editor in chief pretty much wanted to force diversity, it pretty much led to this monster sales slump that pretty much alienated the customer base. And this was just a bad thing to do overall from a business perspective. You would think with the comic book industry still being in a 25 to 30 year slump, you wouldn't want to try to alienate your core customer base in a really bad attempt to try to expand to other customers. There are more constructive ways to expand your customer base to include more women and minorities, but I look at the approaches that Marvel used and they were pretty much ham-fisted and sloppy. Moreover, I look at the content they were producing and it just wasn't strong enough. Now, as a writer of characters of color in my SJS Direct imprint, I understand that there are certain things you need to do as a writer and a publisher to appeal to larger audiences all over the world. And slapping an ethnicity on a character is just not enough. You have to have compelling stories, interesting characters, and really fantastic, fun stories that get readers involved. And this is what I do with my books in my ISIS series and my E-Steam series, and even YA fiction books I do about subjects such as the goth subculture in books like Spinsterella and Spellbound, where I try to take people into these worlds so that they can learn more about a culture, learn more about people, but most importantly, they learn to see people in general. And that's what a really good story is. It gives us characters we can relate to, characters we can identify with, characters we can have a connection to. And that's something that was able to be done with these Marvel comics that talk so much about diversity. All we saw was skin color. We saw no content. And when you have a great story, like the ones I produce at the SJS Direct imprint, you don't see color that much. You just see great characters. And it's those characters that make you want to go out and continue buying the stories and picking up the series because the characters are compelling, their stories are compelling, and that's what gives readers an incentive to keep buying and anticipating those next issues or that next book that comes out. I look at the problems at Marvel Comics as it relates to diversity, and again, it really relates to the lack of diversity behind the scenes. A lot of the big problems that are at Marvel Comics is that there aren't that many qualified African American writers out there or writers of color, and there's no real efforts to go out and find good writers of color who understand the craft of comic books because comic books just like screenwriting is a craft, and you have to understand how that craft works. You have to understand how that story paradigm works. You have to understand how that story model works, and you have to understand what work makes a great character in the comic book medium. And this is one of the big problems with the comic book industry, is that there aren't that many writers out there that understand this craft from who are people of color. There are only like a handful, such as Christopher Priest and a couple of others, but there aren't that many black comic writers out there. And this is something that Marvel and DC should really be looking for: a writer who has that strong fantasy background like myself, a writer who understands the comic book medium, a writer who understands the fantasy medium, a writer who understands the fantasy model, and pretty much can approach it in a way that allows them to create compelling characters that readers can relate to and identify with, and stories that can build a word of mouth and a following not only in the United States but all over the world. And I think I have done that to a point with the ISIS series and the East Team series, because when I do stories, they pretty much do get word of mouth with people not only in the United States but other parts of the world, and that allows people to get that broader perspective on black culture and see that there is more to it than just a skin color, that there is a culture, and they learn a bit more with each story I produce, and they learn more about black people, and that's really what really makes for really good diversity stories. You really want people to learn more about about a culture from a character, and you want to learn more about history and other things as it relates to those characters and their stories. And that's not really something that was done with this recent campaign at Marvel Comics. When I look at this campaign at Marvel Comics, again, it was a really shallow, half-hearted attempt at diversity that really just gave us characters of color, but nothing of substance to connect with. That's all I have to say for this video. You can pick up the ISIS series books on Amazon.com, on Kindle, and you can also pick them up at other e-reader sites such as Smashwords and in paperback.